Murphy has published multiple books on Irish mythology. His 8th book is called Return to Segais, which is an examination of human consciousness through the life cycle of the salmon. In this interview, he discusses with Miriam, also known as the Keltress, how Irish mythology has become even more relevant in the 21st century and why it is we are drawn to it. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of Return to Segais, please go to www.mythicalireland.com. Well, hello everyone. You are very, very welcome back to Writer's Block with Miriam. We took a break for a little while I was getting another show off the ground called Business Block, which we've shot about 21 episodes of now, 9 of which are up. And now we've come back to my baby, my favorite show, which is Writer's Block. And any of you who've been following the show will know that I am a singer. And very, very recently, in the last few years, I decided as a songstress that I would stick with songstress, but also add something else that was very important to me, which was the great and growing love of my own Celtic identity, which gave us, going from songstress, it gave us Keltress, the Keltress, which is what I sing under now. And I just feel that it's no coincidence that that has happened, because so many of us, not only of a certain age, but many of us who migrated and returned to Ireland over the years felt that call back, not unlike the salmon that is so well written about by Anthony Murphy, who is our guest today. And this is his latest book. It's called Return to Segais. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anthony Murphy today to the show. Where are you, Anthony? Tell us where you are. Tell us what you're doing. Tell us how you've been over the last 18 months writing, I'm sure.
Thanks for the lovely welcome, Miriam. I've been fine. I mean, actually, there's been lots of silver linings in this pandemic. It has given me more time and energy for what I would call my Mythical Ireland pursuits.
Yes.
I did a daily live stream for 102 days starting on March the 13th last year. And a lovely community has built up around that. That's a weekly series now because I couldn't keep going every day, you know.
It is just unbelievable. Host of Live Myths and Legends. And that goes out on multiple platforms. And I mean, kudos to you really, Anthony, because I'm reluctant to go onto the live stream forums because I always find that people come back to me after I do the recorded shows and they say, oh, do you mind if we take out this or do you mind if we take out that? But you've gone with the live stream, which is fantastic.
They were funny.
You like the interaction.
Yeah, there were things like plates falling out of the press and dogs barking and stuff. But that's just the nature of live TV, as they say. So once you're willing to kind of, well, the other thing is that, you know, Facebook and YouTube keep the videos, but you can actually, you do have the option with YouTube to edit, you know, if you need to, but I don't generally, I just leave them as they are, you know.
Yeah.
Warts and all, as they say, you know.
Well, there are very few warts because I do tune in on a regular basis and it is an extraordinarily detailed show. But of course, as we can see from behind you there, you've got a wonderful library. When did you start putting the library together and what is it about?
That library behind me is 22 years in the making. A huge amount of it pertains to Irish mythology, archaeology, history, prehistory, but there's a lot of other stuff. I have a great interest in astronomy. I have a fairly substantial interest now in, well, I was going to say psychology, but more to do with Jungian psychology. So I have a shelf devoted to C.G. Jung and Joseph Campbell. There's some Nietzsche work there. There's some Mircea Eliade. What else? I mean, apart from history, I have a section on Greek and classical mythology and history and Egyptian. And then a hodgepodge of other stuff, you know. I mean, I'm a great believer in the mantra that variety is the spice of life, you know.
Absolutely. And of course, we're living in an area where we have, you know, Newgrange, which is, 600 years older than the Pyramid at Giza. I mean, there's so much interconnection between these great sites around the world. and our own incredible Boyne Valley and other sites around the country.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that we only, it's, the emergence of sort of modern Ireland, from being a third world country, or third country as it were, to being a modern economy has happened in my lifetime. And it just so happens that has coincided with the revelations of the monuments, that before then, until the 60s, when the excavations began, they were referred to as Bronze Age monuments. We didn't know actually how old they were. We didn't realize any of this until the archaeologists took the trowels to them and started digging. And I think that's really fascinating, because in addition to that, there's been a whole sort of, it appears anyway, on the surface, that there's been a sort of an awakening,
yes,
a movement, a spiritual movement away from, well, the Catholic Church in Ireland has been ridden with scandal. So that's a big part of the reason. But I think the alternative, or alternatives, that people are looking for in against that backdrop tend to be either all-out atheism, which is quite a number of people these days, or this, I don't know what you'd call it, more insular, native sort of spirituality, something that they can actually go to a place like Newgrange, like Hill of Tara, like so many of these ancient monuments, and feel that they have more than just a tenuous connection with that idea, that spiritual idea or longing that they have. It's not even, I don't think it's kind of, unless you follow a particular religion like paganism, etc. And even that is full of different shades. And as Christianity is, that you go there and you feel that you're making, a real deep connection with that spirituality, with ancestors. And I think that's something that we can do here, because we living on this island. Well, none of us knows really how far back our lineage goes in terms of Irishness. I mean, I keep saying ultimately our origins are beyond these shores. Like all of the people of Ireland today are descended from somebody who once arrived here from somewhere else.
Yes.
But nevertheless, there seems to be that.
Yeah.
I wanted to explore that in a way that wasn't either kitsch, or I wasn't trying to be populist.
Yes.
I certainly didn't want to be conformist, because if you've read Return to Segais, you'll see that like a great deal of it is my own sort of personal journey out of the, that all encapsulating religion that we were brought up with.
Yes. Yes.
Into something that I actually really feel is deeper. It allows you, I think, to make a deeper connection with the divine and
yes.
the transcendent than sitting on a hard bench in a cold church listening to a man, in some cases, because I remember distinctly as a child being at Mass, listening to an old man grumbling on the altar and listening to the congregation mumbling their prayers without any enthusiasm whatsoever.
Yes, not living it.
And I'm
not doing it dutifully.
That's definitely not what this is about.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
But it's about that if we've reached that point where we're filing into churches, we're half-hearted about being there, we're half-hearted about, and our interaction while we're there. And then when we withdraw from that in the evening time or whatever on Sunday afternoon, we're like, how does that make me sort of, the key question would be, how does that bring me closer to God, whoever, yes. whatever God may be?
Yes. And
it took a very major sort of spiritual and psychological crisis in my own life to make me realize that that wasn't, that was an echo chamber for me eventually.
And I understand that. If I could just draw people's attention for a second, just before we come back to that point. As you can see here, there are lots of books written by Anthony, all in and around this this subject area. So there's 8 books. Is it 8 books now altogether?
Number 9 is on the printing press as we
Is
speak.
it?
The Bowen monograph, the second in the monograph series
Oh,
about Bowen, the river goddess. I'm hoping to have that by Friday. So,
oh
number
my gosh, that's fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. Now, I can identify and I can see why there'd be a lot of psychology involved, and why you would intertwine that there. The need. I know a lot of my Irish friends who migrated would identify this need to connect with the land, with the imagery of the land, the need to see. Irish people need to see the horizon. We seem to have this need to be close to sea, to water, but also to see horizons. Horizons seem to play a very big part in
yeah,
our not just our psyche, but our spirituality as well. Our emotional well-being seems to depend on it. And I noticed as a very young person when I migrated at 21, I wasn't aware of this. It was forest for the tree syndrome. I wasn't even aware that all of this was going on. I was so used to it. But other nationalities spotted the difference in me. And sometimes you would find yourself, as an Irish migrant, you would find yourself being isolated, not because they didn't like you, but because they couldn't quite figure out what it was about you that was different,
mm,
you know.
yeah,
And really, it's only years later when you come home, you start to put the pieces together, and that's what it was. They were actually seeing these sides of me, these spiritual sides of me, these reactions, particular mindsets that are very, very much connected to land, sea, and air,
yeah,
born out of that. But of course, at the time when you're young, you don't realize this. You see it so much later on.
yeah,
And reading your work, I can see that is, just coming from that particular perspective that I would have been born out of when I was younger, having been away and coming home. I can see a lot more um, of how I was basically taking myself into a situation where I was experiencing a drought, and
mm,
I was experiencing that drought and as a self-imposed experience. But now coming home, and I'm home now since 2005, a lot has fallen into place, and I have this huge thirst to to throw myself into the very sort of work that you've been writing about. Can I take you for a moment to which seems to have been a very important book, particularly important book. I'll just put the screen up there. Island of the Setting Sun. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that one came about? Because it seems to have been quite pivotal.
Ireland was my first work and remains to this date my largest work, in conjunction with my good friend Richard Moore, the
Mm.
artist.
Yes.
It was really meeting Richard in January of 1999 that proved the catalyst to everything that has happened since, because the questions that he asked me when we first met were the ones that I realized that they moved me deeply in such a way that it almost spoke to me in a way that I said, this is exactly the sort of stuff I was born to do. I mean, I don't know if that sounds grandiose, and I hope it doesn't,
No.
but I was an astronomer.
Yes.
I'm always interested in the stars since I was literally knee high to a grasshopper. Um, Richard had this love of the landscape and painting, and he was very familiar with the Brunabonia monuments. And the whole thing just came together. He knew some about the mythology, and I knew a lot about the stars. And all of a sudden, we were on this odyssey together that lasted actually for 7 years, because the book wasn't published until nearly the end of 2006. And even at that, it is a thesis, and some people who read it, and I don't mind the feedback, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. I prefer good feedback, but obviously, if somebody says to me, which they often do, oh, I had to stop and sort of go back, and I had to, some people just can't read it from beginning to end because of the immensity, the scope of the material that's in there. And that gives you, I suppose, an idea of the challenge that we
Yes.
had to get all that in there and to trim it, because it could have been twice or three times the size, But that journey began in earnest, as I say, in 1999. But the journey to the stars, and that's more than just a science for me. I'm fascinated by the science and the figures and the distances, the temperatures of the stars, the vastness of the universe. I mean, how vast it is.
Yes.
It's mind-numbingly, it's chillingly vast, actually, because you
Yes.
realize that we are actually really alone here on this small rock that we call the Earth. But there was also, I think, I'm currently writing a book about astronomy, but it won't be any ordinary astronomy book. It'll be about the sort of psychological and spiritual aspects of astronomy, looking at the stars, how it makes you feel, how it makes you relate to the Earth and the natural world, and how it actually puts you in contact, in a way, with ancestors of the vast distant past who did
Yes.
exactly the same thing, who looked up at the stars at night in awe. And I think that was one of the major, imperatives behind the construction of the great monuments of Brunebonia, But that book has been reprinted twice in 2020, the new 2020 edition. I think it's probably a remarkable testament to it that it has such a long shelf life.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it has
Absolutely.
opened up such an incredible a number of avenues of exploration for me. Like, it is a tree whose roots grow deep and whose branches have spread, skyward in all sorts of different directions. And every book since has followed those branches in some way,
Absolutely. And you talk about and you use, I know, technology. You use drones. You've made some amazing discoveries lately, haven't you? Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I feel it's a kind of a funny thing, when I was
Photography and other forms of technology.
yeah, it's like a camera in the sky. When I was a child, and I haven't written about this yet, and it's something I must write about. When I was a child, there were two dreams that I had. Was one that was very persistent, was that I was floating, and I don't think that's an unusual dream, but it was a very specific floating over the landscape at height, sort of drifting with the town and the river and the landscape drifting below you, and it was what's the word? It was, I was elated. It was uplifting. It was a wonderful experience in the dream. The other dream was that I would someday find. I dreamt that I would find a very important manuscript hidden in the walls of a monastery, and that is really curious because although I haven't physically, literally found that, I think that's more to do with tapping into, the wisdom of the past. But then in 2018, I mean, talk about winning the lottery. I found what we call Drone Henge,
Yes.
this giant late Neolithic henge at Brunebonia, like 700 yards from Newgrange, that all of the specialists and the archaeologists of the past few generations completely missed, and it's completely understandable that they missed it, by the way. That's not a criticism. And here it is revealing itself to my drone. I feel remarkably blessed.
That was an extraordinary, extraordinary situation that could have happened, Drone henge. Anyone would wonder why it hadn't been discovered before, but if they didn't have the interest in calculations and mathematics and understanding alignments, they'd brush it off. They wouldn't realize, even if they had seen it.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. It's kind of recognizing something when you see it as being important. But certainly, I mean, almost every day since, I kind of still kind of feel kind of dreamlike about it, as if as if it didn't happen, almost as if it's hard to believe sometimes. It was very hard to believe in the weeks afterwards, especially when the world's media, I mean, I'm talking about CNN and
Yes.
National Geographic, Washington Post, New York Times, newspapers in Japan, TV stations in China, and I was kind of swept up in this whirlwind of interest in it. And at the time, every day, I was like, somebody's going to slap me in the face and wake me
Yes.
up and say, Anthony, will you wake up? You're dreaming,
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes.
and as you know, I recently, as you probably know, found a few log boats in
Yes. The
the River
log boats.
Boyne, And that was another very serendipitous discovery.
Oh my
Like,
goodness.
the amount of luck involved in that. Like, I went down there to have a look for the dolphin, Kevin Costner, the dolphin. And
Yes, yes, who's been very active lately.
yeah, I know, hasn't he? And I happened to go on the day when, at the moment, when there was a full moon, which is when you get the highest high tides and the lowest low tides of the month.
Yes.
And we had like 6 weeks of drought where there had been so little rainfall that the river was extremely deprived of water.
Yes.
And I just arrived at this moment, and that stuff.
Yeah, the timing. You say to yourself, can this really be coincidence?
But then the other question is, do you then you then sort of say, oh, I must be special, somebody must be looking after me, and that I think is the wrong road to go down. I think the main thing is that I'm extremely grateful for those discoveries, and I'm extremely grateful to have had the opportunity as a writer and a journalist and a photographer and an explorer to be able to do this work, you know?
Well, if I could just bring up your website here. So this is the Mythical Ireland website. I think you have some photographs of those logboats, don't you?
Yeah, if you go into the blog link there.
Into the blog link, okay.
Yeah, you'll probably see.
There we are. So in your blog here, Anthony, you've got various references here. So you've got third logboat spotted by drone on the river at Drogheda. How many altogether?
There were 3, and then a local gentleman brought my attention to a fragmented 4th on the riverbank. There were 3, and 2 of the 3 were new discoveries. One was previously known about. So actually, in those pictures there, those images are both what I call boat number 1 and boat number 3. Boat number 1 is on the left and right. On the right there, that's Dr. Niall Gregory examining boat number 1, and then in the middle, boat number 3. So they're the new ones, or as it were, new ones. They're very old, but I mean, new discoveries.
And what are we talking about? Estimates on age yet? Are they coming through? Or?
Yeah, well, despite the fact that they're notoriously difficult to date, Dr. Gregory is kind of fairly happy that they're medieval. They are probably date from the last 500 years. There have been logboats found. One in the Boyne there above Oldbridge in 2016 was dated to the Neolithic, yes. Same age as Newgrange. Unbelievable stuff.
That was unbelievable. That's why I'm wondering, did these go back as far? But perhaps not all of them. It is extraordinary that they haven't been found before.
Yeah, because they're not that far down in the water, and you'd imagine with all the activity on the river there over the years, water sports and rescue groups and anglers, that's what amazed me about the fact that it'd never been seen before,
Let me just take you to the photograph here, The Miracle of the Return of Segais. Now let's get ourselves back to the book again. So as you can see there, folks, we have a salmon who is returning from the Atlantic. And here this is in Slane, isn't it?
Yep, that's the floodgate in Slane.
The floodgate in Slane, and it is literally jumping and it's making its way back to where it was spawned.
Incredible stuff.
It is just amazing that this should be the it's just amazing that this could possibly be something they could navigate, and they can actually take themselves back to almost exactly the right place, the actual place.
It was actually that day standing on the riverbank. I mean, I never expected to see salmon. I went down there to take pictures of the river, and over the period of about an hour and a half, I saw about 15 or 16 salmon jumping over the weir and the floodgate. And that was winter 2016, I think, sort of October 2016. And afterwards, when I read about them, because I'd never seen this, I read about, the fact that they're spawned upriver, they spend a few years there, then they develop a physiological makeup that enables them to make that journey, as it were, that across the threshold, as it were, from fresh water to salt water, and come back again, you know.
And that is what's amazing, isn't it? They are both salt and fresh water.
Brackish is the term, you know, where the waters meet, which is at Inver Culpa, which is obviously a major sort of influence in the story, because a lot of mythological events happen not just in the river, but in the estuary of the river. But the incredible thing about the Atlantic salmon is that its feeding grounds are actually about 2,000 or 3,000 miles northwest of us, up around Greenland.
Yes.
So having been spawned in the river and spending a few years there, they come down out into the sea, find their way to the ocean. Some of them come back after a year. Some of them mightn't come back for 5 years, mightn't come back for 10 years. But that journey that they make is quite often the last journey that they make to spawn the next generation. And like you said, they have this remarkable, miraculous ability to find pretty much the precise place where they were born in order to do this and commit this one last act before dying. It is the most remarkable thing. I think there's a quote in Segais somewhere where I say, you know, that with all our technology and with all the remarkable things we've done as humans, sending people to the moon, and we can talk to each other from one side of the earth to the other and all that stuff, that I am still overawed, you know, in sort of beholding the magic of this creature that's able to do something that, you know, we could only do if we were equipped with all this GPS technology, etc., etc. They have it naturally.
They have it naturally.
No?
It is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. And it's very beautiful as well. And it actually, in many respects, it does restore your faith in nature and in time, and time as the healer, and time bringing you back to what's important, you know. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, the parallels between the returning migrant or the returning immigrant, or, you know, Irish who are maybe second, third generation in other countries, who just feel this call. And there's something that you say in one of your videos as well. You talk about, you know, whether you're born in Ireland or not, if the land gets its clutches into you, it's very difficult to lose that.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing you there, but you know, it is absolutely true. You'll find people who have a mindset that they don't always quite understand. They may not have been born in this country, but for some reason, their mindset and their whole spiritual side as well just gravitates towards this country. But there's something to do with the land itself, the actual the stones, the rivers, the actual makeup of the land that they connect with.
I think that's one of the reasons, like one of the principal metaphors of the book is the salmon, the other ones being the well of Segais, Bowen the goddess, Amergin of the Amergin the Milesian bird, and a few others. But
Merlin is supposed to have been modeled on him.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. But the reason I think that metaphor of the salmon returning, coming and going, I mean, it resonates on so many levels, because it is also symbolic of our journey from, you know, the womb to the tomb, as it were, you know, from being a zygote and you know, a helpless baby to adolescence and puberty and adulthood. And all of the thresholds that we cross on the way, the weirs, the salmon weirs that the salmon has to navigate in order to do this. And it is really remarkable that it's able to do all that and still, you know, come up and down the river. And then the idea that we can go out to explore this vast ocean, which is really within ourselves, that metaphor of, you know, because it's restated so much. I mean, there's a lot of it's poetic repetition in Return to Segais. Like, it's contrived, it's intended, you know, it's not accidental. It's not that I ran out of things to say and I just repeated myself. But the metaphor of going down into the water of both the well and, of course, the ocean, is straight out of Jung. That's the exploration of our own dark psyche, our own shadow, our own unconscious, and not just the dark aspects of it, but they're the parts that we tend to allow to remain concealed, because we
And I've
like,
heard you talk
you know,
before, and it connects up with what you're saying there. I've heard you talk before about how in mythology, very often those images which look like warning images are in fact, when you go forth and explore them, they're not like the Cailleach, for example. You know,
mm,
the dream you talked
oh
about
yeah, yeah,
of
yeah,
having the vision in your dream of the old, Cailleach,
yes,
who is scary and who's long haired and grey, and basically, an old crone.
yeah,
But in fact, you went in the dream when you went over and you kissed her hand, she became this woman in her 30s,
yeah,
40s, nothing to be afraid of.
yeah. As I say, like, if I had contrived that dream, she probably would have turned out like a supermodel. But she wasn't a supermodel. She transformed into somebody that you could relate to,
Yes.
as a woman who is sort of has encompassed all of her aspects. That's not worried about skin deep beauty, and that seems to carry all this wisdom with her. And the amazing thing about the Cailleach dream was that everybody was running in terror from this Cailleach, and I kept going and walking towards her
Yes.
in a tunnel winding down into the earth. Again, that's the metaphor of going down into
Into the
oneself.
shadows, yes,
And,
and into the water.
the most amazing thing, which was what's the word, spontaneous, very spontaneous, was that as we met, she raised her hand towards me, and I took it instinctively and kissed it. So,
Yes.
you know, that was an indication that yes, I'm accepting the challenge of crossing this threshold,
Yes.
because the Cailleach could be seen as a threshold guardian. By the way, in the Boyne, one of the great myths, which is the subject of the first monograph, is Finn McCool, the Salmon of Knowledge. Well,
Yes.
Finn also meets a threshold guardian who is Finnegas, the wise druid. He's the one who wants the fish. Jevna, who is Finn, who before he becomes Finn, before his initiation, basically, Jevna comes along and asks him, can he help him? And of course, Finnegas says, well, you can cook the fish, but, don't eat any of it, In other words, I'm confining you to this minimal role in my story. And of course, the rest, as to say, is history. Finn burns his thumb, sucks his thumb, gets all the knowledge. And Finnegas magnanimously realizes this is what was fated to occur. But Finnegas was the threshold guardian, in as much that he was there to say, hang on a second, you can come here, but you can't, you can and you can't, and you can and you can't. Thou shalt and thou shalt not.
Yes.
The commandments and the proscriptions, what you can do and what you can't do. This is where the work of Joseph Campbell comes in a major way. And I suppose you could summarize all of the foregoing in one thing that Campbell said, or is reported to have said: the cave that you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. And
Yes.
that cave, guarded by the dragon or the
Yes.
mystery hag or whatever it happens to be,
Yes.
is the cave of yourself that is in darkness to you because you haven't brought light down there, because you're afraid to do so. And consequently, you wear a mask, and the ego and the persona are what you present to the world. But as Jung says, that water is the constant metaphor for the unconscious. And as he said, like, if you think about the surface of the well of Segais, that is a mirror. And Jung says the mirror reflects faithfully back at you what it sees, not what you want to see, but what is actually there. And when Bowen approaches the well, and her story is complex, but when she approaches the well, I think part of what happens is that the eruption is to do with the fact that perhaps she has looked to the bottom of the well, which the Dinshanicus mythology says you're not supposed to do. And I think the reason for that is, and I'm exploring that even in further work that I'm writing now, Segais doesn't cover it all, is that, she has basically, she needed help with that. You don't just suddenly allow all the contents of your unconscious to spew forth, because that will lead to a disintegration. It has to be a careful process of introspection. One should not, one should be rather prudent in terms of that exploration. It comes to some people in times of crisis, and I believe that my own journey, which is exposed in a cathartic fashion in Return to Segais, is that a very large sort of psychological catastrophe happened to me, which actually brought me down there. I had no choice. It was as if life said, now, Murphy, now's the time you've got to confront all this stuff. The time for faffing around, you know, reaching into the darkness. And as I said very early on, the echo chamber that Christianity had become to me, and I would say more Catholicism. I think Christianity still has a lot of beautiful. I mean, I still quote the Bible regularly. It doesn't become
irrelevant. It doesn't become irrelevant. Yes.
The sins of paedophile priests don't make the whole of Scripture irrelevant. That's the thing. They don't render it useless. But it had become an echo chamber, and finally, it was time to confront it. It's like, okay, well, where are we going with this? And well, I was pushed into it, and I went down into the waters very deeply for a long time.
Yes.
But that's not to say, because you have to be very careful about this. I believe that I've come to Return to Segais as a poet primarily, not as a preacher. Okay, so I'm not trying to preach to anybody, definitely not. That turns me off. It's like, no, that's the antithesis of what I'm trying to do here, is the idea that I will stand on a pulpit and preach to you and lecture to you, and you will go, oh yes, we must do this and we must do that. Everybody must find their own way to the well. Every salmon that comes into the river faces all these threats that I use as metaphorical images in the book. The weirs, the salmon, or sorry, the otter, the heron, you know, the angler, the fisherman, all of the things that will potentially snare it and trap it and prevent it from going there, you know?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I just for a moment, I just want to, for anyone who might be tuning in who actually isn't aware that the River Boyne comes from Bowen. This is actually very important within Irish culture. We have a reverence for the River Boyne. We have all kinds of other rivers as well. You'll know the Shannon, you'll know the Liffey, but this particular river that is just at the end of my garden, actually. In fact, it is an extremely important and referred to as a she. It is regarded as being female.
Yeah.
And there are various, this is what you've done. And if you could just take us to the characters, although you do not create characters, you've taken the mythical figures and gods and goddesses, mainly goddesses in Ireland. You've taken those and you have produced a stream of consciousness in this book. Can you talk about this? Because I know James Joyce tried to do this with Ulysses. Some people love it, some people don't. I actually think that it works and has found its home in this particular type of book.
Well,
as a mythical connection.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see, look, again, through the idea of poetic repetition, you'll see that obviously Bowen is an extremely important exemplar for me in that book. I want to see her reconstitution, actually, because in the myth she's dismembered and drowned, you see.
Yes.
And it's like the feminine aspect of us. I'm talking about the male, the patriarchy, the male dominated world, you know, sort of that is what has happened. The feminine has become dissolved and dissipated in the waters, the feminine aspect that is within us. And I want to see a reconstitution of Bowen, because I think in dismembering the goddess, we've done great harm, because there's this constant need for balance, the light and the dark, conscious, subconscious, wisdom, ignorance, you know, God, goddess, you know, male, female. This antinomy, this tension of opposites that's there, is actually a fundamental aspect of who we are as humans. If you try to pretend that one side of that doesn't exist, you just make it lopsided. You just you try to pull apart the polarity and say that doesn't exist because there's only one side.
Yeah.
And what happens is that side tries to compensate for the loss of the other side, which is a disaster. So Bowen is extremely important. There's a chapter very early on in the book called Bowen Remade. And this came to me spontaneously, what I call extemporaneously. You know, I didn't contrive this. This
Yes.
book flowed through me in a way that there was no conscious effort on my behalf to structure this in any way. It flowed, and I allowed it to flow the way it wanted to flow.
Yes.
Bowen's dismemberment and drowning, for me, was a disastrous aspect of our mythology that actually resonates in the modern history of Ireland. Then, on the other side, we have the male, and Amergin Glungyal, the poet of the Milesians. His name actually means birth of song, or born of song. He is credited as being the first poet in Ireland. Of course, the Danans had their own poets. So, you know, they say history is written by the victor. So every time a new wave or invasion comes in, they try to say, well, you know, we have the first poet and we have the first this and that and the other. But aside from that, Amergin was able to do something that I think separates him from his brothers, because they all wanted war with the Danans. They wanted blood. They wanted battle.
Yes.
Amergin wanted to meet the goddesses of Ireland on their terms, in their places. And at Ishnach, the heart, the umbilical cord, umbilicus hiberniae, the omphalos of Ireland, he was able to get, not by coercion, but I think because there was this mutuality, he was able to get Eru to agree, right, okay, if you call this country after me, we'll give it to you. And I think what she was saying was, you recognize the feminine aspect by calling the, you said it about the Boyne. It's hugely important that the Boyne is feminine, but I think it's vastly more important to our history that the island takes its name. Ireland, Ireland, takes its name from a goddess. So that's one aspect of it, was those figures. Sort of, you know, feeding in and out of that are the likes of Finn McCool, Fintan, you know, this wise ancestor deity, you know, but then the non-anthropomorphic forms, the salmon being the principal one, the others, the call of the birds, imagining that the first
the
call
curlew
of the birds, was like a beginning, was like a moment of creation, that it was actually the birds that sang creation into being. But Amergin's song, this idea of being born of song, birth of song, I think, and I express it, I hope in a way that's really beautiful in Return to Segais, that he actually birthed a song in me, which was this whole new way of looking at first of all, my own interaction with what you might call the divine, but secondly, my own mortality, which Christianity had never done, because there was always this idea that, well, you have to believe in Jesus and you have to obey the commandments and you have to do this and you have to do that. And I felt I could never live up to that. And
I think that this is where Mythical Ireland's following has also come from, because I don't think you're alone there. I think a lot of us are on that journey, and we're not all in this country. You know, as you see the phenomenal growth of interest in Mythical Ireland since it started. When did it start again?
Well, actually, the website started in the year 2000. It's been 21 years on the go now.
Yeah.
Back before we had, you know, back in the internet 1.0, as you might call it, you know, when I mean, dial-up was a thing, you know, I had to upload, I had to scan printed photographs. It was
oh my God, I remember.
But, you know, in relation to Amergin, I think that there was a breakthrough for me in that it was, can I say this? I hope I don't upset anybody. And I actually, now I'm more comfortable at saying I have a love for Jesus that I never had when I was a Christian.
Yes.
Because I look at the Beatitudes and I look at how he spoke. He spoke metaphorically. All his lessons were parables. So he's more a poet and a mystic than he is anything else.
Yes.
But the thing that I was going to say was, Amergin, for me, is a figure of pseudo-history stroke mythology, who I can actually put much more truck in, who brings me much further to the realization of God in myself, and I'm not saying I'm God. I mean the realization, the crossing of the threshold to the divine. He has brought me much closer to that than Jesus ever did.
Yes.
And I now realize that, you know, when I faithfully said my prayers as a child, as I used to every day, as I said, eventually it was like an echo chamber. It was like just I was saying something and it was just going off into the ether, and I might as well have been, you know, reciting Wordsworth, because it wasn't having any effect. It certainly wasn't having any effect on my ability, as I say, to Jesus. I think has been built up. I think it's to do with interpretation. I think Jesus and the things that he said are pretty close to it. But I think it was all this intermediary stuff that what we want, is it not, is to directly communicate with God. And John Moriarty, who's been a huge influence for me in this regard. And by the way, I have to say that I'm not comparing myself to John Moriarty. He is way up there beyond anything I've ever seen in poetic and spiritual terms in Ireland. He is way above anybody else. But he brought it to, sort of really into focus for me, was this idea that you could encounter the divine in the Irish landscape. Now, John O'Donoghue did it as well, but I think John O'Donoghue is like the popular audience's version of Moriarty. Moriarty is he's a much deeper philosopher, and he had a much broader knowledge of the classical mythology and religion and, you know, Eastern philosophy and spirituality. Moriarty
and spiritualism, and
you know, Moriarty, I think, realized that, and I think he wanted to see a revivification of Christianity, which is the big difference between Moriarty and me. I don't believe that Christianity will serve us in the future. And in a way, in order to go forward, we need to go back. And that is back to the stuff that was here before Paddy arrived, St. Patrick.
Yeah, that's the road I'm on too. And a number of my friends. Yes, absolutely.
Because in a sense, isn't it a case that when St. Patrick was allegedly was supposed to have deposed the snakes, what he was actually doing was he was deposing that feminine, that is the snake, especially the snake in man, is a symbol from, is it Kundalini yoga? It is an essence that is very important. You know, snakes could also have been seen to represent paganism and what have you. But in removing that, I believe that was the disaster happened. All those, I don't know when. See, I think that Bowen's story is primordial. I believe that is a creation myth that goes right back to Mesolithic, pre-Neolithic times, is what I actually believe. Now, you won't hear any scholar backing me up on that, because they'd say, oh, it was only written down in the Middle Ages. How can we know that? Well, we can't know it, but we can get a sense of it, I think. And the disaster...
There are always pointers, aren't there?
Yeah. The disaster happened for us when we dismembered the feminine and cast her out to sea.
And at what point did that happen? Like, when you say that, for people who don't know, who haven't actually ventured into this area, at what point does that start presenting itself to us in our history, in our literature?
You mean the effects of it?
Yes.
I would say almost immediately, because remember the Milesians, although they were successful, and remember Amergin stands out from his brothers as something entirely different. I think Amergin is elevated. He's divine. He's got divine status. The rest of them are warriors. As I said, they wanted blood. It started in historic terms, or prehistoric terms. It started, I think, with the Bronze Age, particularly. The Neolithic, maybe to an extent. We don't know enough about the Irish Neolithic yet, I think, to build up a significant enough picture. But if you think about the Milesians representing the Beaker culture and the Bronze Age arrivals, they were trying to get rid of the Dedanans and get them back into their passages, their She, their mounds, you know, go back down there. And in essence, that was a way of saying, okay, these are the elevated parts of our consciousness that want to transcend our mortal beings, that want to communicate with the divine, and we want to shove them underground. Yes. And so you can see the effect of it almost immediately. There's no point in pretending. We can't put any sort of a historical date on the story of Bowen approaching Nectan's well. What we can say is that she and her husband, who is Nectan or Elkmar or Nuadu, and the Dagda, are all figures that are directly related to the Brunabonia complex of monuments. In my view, it could be said, or it could be postulated, that therefore this mythology may just go all the way back to those times. And
Yes.
if that's the case, then the disaster started happening when we dismembered the goddess. However, and I hate to this is the antinomy that I was talking about, the dichotomy. There's always a flip side. The flip side is that there are lots and lots of prehistoric societies that imagine the creation of the cosmos, beginning with the dismemberment of a giant or a monster or a deity. So there's a flip side to it. It could be that this was a cosmogonic myth. This was the beginning of things. This was how the world began. Remember, her arm and her leg formed bits of the Boyne, and she was drowned at the estuary. And the same with the monster, the Mata,
Yeah.
featured, whose name, by the way, might be related to Moher, as in the Irish word for mother.
Yes.
You know, the mother beast that gave birth to the world. Because after it was chopped to pieces, its pieces started forming landscape features. That is an aspect of very, very ancient Indo-European and world mythology. So, you know, on the one hand, I think psychologically, spiritually, I think it was disastrous for us to dismember the feminine and throw her into the waters. But then on the other hand, it may have been seen as a necessity. And if any of your viewers have ever read Mircea Eliade, in particular Patterns in Comparative Religion, and his most famous work, The Myth of the Eternal Return, he talks about this. And so does Philip Freund, who wrote about world creation myths. The idea that the creation is presupposed or preordained, or you know, that before creation there's this dismemberment. It's necessary. It's a prerequisite for the creation to occur. So there's even that and as I say, I'm continuing to write work pertaining to Bowen and Return to Segais, and I'm exploring all this. I'm trying to tease it out in case people say, Anthony Murphy, you are contradicting yourself. My answer to that is no. The mythology contradicts itself. We must understand why that contradiction is inherent in the myth, you know?
Yes, like what's the function? Again, you quoted Campbell at one point, and he said, one of his, I'm presuming it's the same Campbell, the primary function of magic and myth is to create the possibility of awe, to be awe-inspired by something.
Well, isn't this the biggest part of it? How in the modern age, and I'm asking this, everybody who watches this, I'm asking this to you, and you need to answer to yourself, not to me. Don't talk back to the camera because I won't be able to hear you. How do you approach a sense of awe in your life? How often does that come to you, and how and where? What are the circumstances of it? Because if it's, you know, watching a particular TV program, or, you know, flying at 30,000 feet over the sea or something, that's not really where it should be, because that sort of idea of transcendence out of your body into higher realms can happen literally anywhere. But it is aided at all times by, I think, I'm speaking personally, in my case, it's aided by a journey into the landscape.
Yes.
I find it very difficult to encounter awe sitting in traffic in Drogheda. But if I go out along the Boyne Valley by just 3 or 4 miles, and I take a walk along the Boyne River or the canal or somewhere in the vicinity of one of the monuments, and especially if it's twilight or
or sunset,
the stars out, you know, then it becomes, you know,
transcendent. It's an epiphany experience to see the sun go down sometimes. on the
How
River
often
Boyne.
do
It
we,
is
but
just
how
like,
often do we
and
do
I've
that?
lived all over the world. You know, I've been very fortunate in my life. I've lived in Africa. I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in Europe. I haven't seen anything as beautiful.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
really beautiful.
That was the idea that you were talking about there in the video. The video that you referred to earlier on, I call the she power, which is the power of the landscape over you. That
Yes.
you feel that at any moment, all of those mystical other worlds described in the mythology could just literally emerge into this one, because the veil, as it were, and I know that's a cliche, but we're constantly, I think, living in a liminal space in Ireland. I think it's often said that, you know, Ireland is a place where it rains a lot, and you know we get all this capricious weather and all the rest. But I I do think that there's something here, which I tap into, I think, more as a poet than than as a priest, as it were, because as I said, I've no desire to be a preacher, and that is sometimes. And I see it in, I know, Miriam, I think you have an interest in Francis Ledwidge.
Yes.
There's a beautiful, excuse me, there's a beautiful stanza in my favorite poem of Ledwidge's, and for your viewers, Ledwidge grew up at Slane, close to Nowth and the Boyne Valley monuments. He loved the valley very much, and it's incorporated into his work. There's a stanza in there that actually almost moves me to tears. It makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I think about it, and that is this: since the poets perished and all they cherished in the way, their thoughts unsung like petal showers inflame the hours of blue and grey. And I introduced that into a chapter of my Mythical Ireland book, which was published in 2017. And I remember reading that chapter at a launch that I was doing in Dundalk. And as I went on, my voice was breaking. My eyes were welling up. I was actually reaching the moment of sort of an emotional, I wouldn't call it a relapse. I actually think it was a moment of awe that Ledwidge had perceived something that is so precious, that so few people ever get to appreciate, that real moment of awe that he was talking about. Since the poets perished, some of his work appears to foreshadow his own demise. And I think that
Yes.
poem, he said, you know,
Yes.
the very last stanza: a loud tramp of men we'll hear again at Rossnaree. I woke, or, you know, a bomb burst near me where I lay. I woke, 'twas day in Picardy. I mean, he was killed by a bomb explosion
Yes.
in on the battlefields of World War One,
Mm.
of the Great War. And I think he approached that in the twilight of the Boyne Valley. He got a sense of that. He got a sense of, there are moments in my own experience, and I hope you've experienced it, and I hope everybody who's watching it has experienced, where you stand, usually on close to the river, where my heart belongs, as Ledwidge's did,
Yes.
where I actually sort of, for a moment, you're like, oh yeah, I feel right now as if I'm living in forever.
And the thing is, can
You
you
know?
actually embrace that? You know, do people dismiss it too much? The important thing is to embrace that, to invite more of that moment of awe.
I think, Miriam, the great problem today is because we live in a post-rational world and a post-religious world, in some respects, a secular world. And I'm not saying we need to go back to Christianity or Catholicism and all the stuff, the baggage that goes. I'm not saying that at all. But I think the problem is that we're expecting it to be something different. We live in the generation of the Instagram selfie,
Yes.
where people go to a sacred place and they go, whoo, take a picture of themselves smiling. Look at me, aren't I great, in front
Yeah.
of the pyramids, or at the Taj Mahal,
It's just
or at the
pathetic.
Grand Canyon. But standing by the River Boyne, especially in the summer twilight, I have at times found myself transported to another world.
Yes.
And I didn't need to spend money. That event didn't need me to describe it in a blog post when I come back home. That's the stuff I kept to myself. That's the stuff that emerges in a
Yes.
way in work like Return to Segais. Is that, how often does it happen? Where does it happen? And did you contrive it? Was there anything in it that was forced? You know, did you persuade it to happen? And of course, the answer in almost exclusively is no. It is something that it's fleeting, those moments of transcendence that in this modern, frenetically paced life, this material existence where we're all chasing our tails, stuck in traffic jams. Well, not so much since COVID, thankfully, but you know, stuck in rush hour traffic, going to a job that, like, I'd say 80% of people are not fulfilled in their work, and I'd say only 5% of people are truly fulfilled in their work. And for those people, they're looking for that, and sometimes they don't see that actually those moments come in the simplest way.
Yes, and they are visited upon you almost if you're just open to it, and you become even more aware that it hasn't been contrived, because it's been practically done onto you, to borrow some religious wording, but it has.
I hope,
and I know what you mean.
Has conveyed that in a sense, because I know that as a work, there'll be people who'll read it and just say, I don't get this at all. I know
but it's not the time.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, maybe that's in their case, they're not ready. You know, one thing I can say about it is it's heartfelt.
Absolutely.
It's an honest outpouring. It was cathartic from my point of view.
I was just going to say that from the point of view of a writer, you know, and this is writer's block. How did you feel once you had basically crossed the I's, dotted the I's, crossed the T's, finished the book, had a look at the final draft? Where were you with it then? Did you feel, oh my gosh?
Well, I'll tell you, Miriam,
my sixth child has been born.
This is the truth, right? Every time I came back to it, and it was 2 years written before it was published, every time I came back to it, I would have a different opinion of it. Some days I go, oh, geez, Anthony, no, I'd be embarrassed. And then the next time I come back to it, I'd be like, did you really write this? This is profound. This is just poetically wonderful, immersive, soulful, heartfelt stuff. It's like nothing. And of course, it wasn't like anything I'd ever written. And the next time I come back to it, I'd be self-critical again. But that is the mode of the creative. We are our own worst self-critics. And sure,
and I've only written 3 books. You've written 8, so I can imagine how much further on you are in the journey. But this particular book, because it is quite different to the others, although connected in subject matter, the others would be more journalistic and more academic. This was different. And so how you were and how you felt the next step would be once you've published that. It's only last year, isn't it?
It was only published in March of this year.
March of this year.
Yeah.
Just did you immediately feel that you had to do this follow-up, or what was your feeling once you'd finished it? Have you put that to bed now, or? No.
I mean, the follow-ups, I mean, the Finn monograph and the Bowen monograph, you will see, you know, there is an interrelationship here with the work. The new work that I'm writing is actually a companion volume to Return to Segais.
Oh, right.
It's an attempt to explain it rationally, which I know is stupid, because the poetic is not supposed to be explained rationally, but it's like, I suppose, in a way that I'm hoping that maybe the likes of Joseph Campbell might have written about mythology, that I'm looking back at this now with a new lens, trying to decipher some of its more opaque imagery, because some of it appears to be, you know, a little bit not out there, but perhaps just it's because it's so poetic, you know, that maybe it needs an explanation, and maybe I need the explanation.
I think the idea of bringing a guide in, particularly, you know, writing a guide particularly for people who can feel the connection with it but are in other cultures, so they may need some parallels brought in, you know. I mean,
that's a big part of it, because it presupposes it pre-imagines that you've read or are familiar with the mythology of the Boyne and its monuments and its landscape. And of course, a lot of people who maybe come to read Return to Segais won't be, and therefore will be at something of a disadvantage.
Yeah, I understand where
No,
you're going with that. Yeah, I understand. And that's no bad thing.
but by the way, when I read John Moriarty, I feel that oh my God, every page I'm like, okay, I need to go to my Greek stuff,
Yes.
pick out something, because his knowledge was just so immense. So it's not necessarily a huge disadvantage, because why? Because it encourages you. I suppose it encourages people to reach out for that, to expand their knowledge. And when you expand your knowledge, you expand your wisdom, you grow. We're all growing, aren't we?
Absolutely, we are. Just because I mean we could talk about this for hours, because it's
Would
something
be
I'm
my
into. So,
pleasure. And I
but
can.
at the same time, we are where we are in this pandemic, and hopefully we are, as writers and creative people, we are having maybe a slightly easier time, slightly easier time, because we're not afraid to go into that space and be creative. We have a blueprint for doing that, and we enjoy it. What would you say? What would your advice be to people who are really struggling, and perhaps they're facing that journey now? Maybe they feel they should have done it before, but they feel the call to write, and they feel the call to explore this side of their identity, the spiritual side, the connection between being Irish and mythology.
That actually is a supremely relevant and excellent question, because this is a theme that I've actually been exploring in other writing that I don't intend to publish, just what you might call journal writing, or just getting my thoughts out. The principal thing is, in order to be a writer, one must write.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the silliest thing, but if you listen to other authors, it's what they say. It's like, look, if there are so many people who never achieve a published book because they have spent their whole time talking about it and thinking about it, but not actually writing it. Now, if you're worried about that, you're not confident in your writing, or that at times you don't think your writing's any good, again, the same advice applies. Just write. Because I find if you write that stuff that you're not intending to have published, and if you just write, for instance, some days about what's on your mind, your thoughts, you're actually unblocking. And like,
Yes.
Return to Segais it's very opening, apart from the foreword. The first short chapter is called A River of Ink.
Yes.
And
yes, exactly.
That 2-page chapter is actually an unblocking exercise. That's what it is.
Yes.
It was an attempt for me to release the tension behind the pen. And again, the symbol of the well bursting forth to create the river is there. But it was there as an unblocking exercise. So just think about when your water is turned off and there's Irish Water repairing the mains or whatever. Well, they'll tell you, turn back on your water, but you have to, leave your tap on for half an hour because you got muddy water. Yes. And so in essence, what you're doing is you're clearing the muddy water out of the system in order for the clear water to flow. Yes. So you must write, and you must listen. I proved something to myself with the publication of my first novel, which is The Cry of the Sebok, which I have copies of there in front of me. I proved something to myself, which was I had convinced myself at the time, I haven't got the time to write. I haven't got the time. I'm too busy working and all the other things, young family and, 5 kids and domestic life and all the other things I was involved with. I haven't got the time. And then one day I said, right here, Anthony, challenge yourself. Can you write a novel in your spare time? But I don't have any spare time. And then I started thinking, well, could you get up 10 minutes early in the morning and write for 10 minutes? I was carpooling with my brother on the way to work. So some days I'd be a passenger in his car sitting in the passenger seat. Could you not bring a notebook and write? At lunchtime in work, when you're in Dublin, what do you do? If your colleagues aren't going for a walk or whatever, you might just end up wasting the hour on your own sitting around. Go to the car or find a step to sit on and write. And I wrote a book in 6 months. In time that I didn't have. Yes. So I don't believe for a second, unless you are Michael O'Leary or you're one of these fabulously busy business owners or entrepreneurs or politicians like the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach or whatever. I don't believe for a second that you can't find at least 5 minutes in your day to sit down and write. If you're any good with a computer or even handwriting, you could write 200 to 300 words as a sitting. And if you actually give yourself half an hour or an hour, you could write 1,000. If you could write 1,000 words today, that means you could write 1,000 tomorrow. That means you'll have 7,000 done by the end of the week. That means in 10 weeks' time, you'll be a good way towards a novel. You know, I mean,
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And then you will start to experiment with different genres as well. And don't be surprised, folks, if you do try this, don't be surprised if you have to take a hiatus for a while, or perhaps what you're writing you don't necessarily feel works, that you're still unblocking.
Yeah.
That moment will come where you'll find that.
And let the better stuff emerge. Yeah,
exactly. It will happen. And the thing is, just grow to like it, grow to enjoy it. Because I always used to say to my students, I said, you know, your subject, your books, your pen, they are your best friends. They will never turn on you. You know, they will never turn on you. So grow to like them. Doesn't matter what the teacher's like. Doesn't matter. Don't let your French teacher put you off French. You know, don't let that happen. It's a relationship that you have to grow yourself with the subject, independent of the people involved, that they should have a good effect on you, but they don't always, you know.
Yeah, the reason I can speak with any authority on this is because I used to be like that myself. For years I talked about writing and I never did, and I just didn't have the confidence. And you just ignore all the voices, ignore all the good, especially the bad advice. Oh, you shouldn't, and you shouldn't, you shouldn't. Just sit down and start writing.
Just do it. In fact, Maureen Jennings, the author of Murdoch Mysteries and various other detective novels, she said exactly the same thing. She said it got to a point. She wasn't, you know, in her youth at this stage. She said it got to a point where I was teaching all of these creative writing classes, and I was not producing the work myself. I was not actually following my own advice.
Yeah. Wow.
And then she began to write Murdoch, which was 4 plays actually first. And then look at what happened. It became a huge success. But, you know, I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. And what a lovely way to end our time today on Writer's Block. Again, Anthony, just to let people know, your books are in the main available through Liffey Press, but Return to Segais is available how? And in the future, where will people be able to get it?
On the website, because of the lockdown, I'll be honest, it was virtually impossible to get it into bookshops because they weren't open.
Yes.
So for the moment, mythicalireland.com, all copies dispatched from here are signed by my good self. After a while in the bookshops, I hope. But this is the worst thing about self-publishing, is that the distribution becomes a problem. You know, you have complete control over the publication, how it looks, the design, you know,
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this is the most fantastically produced book. I mean, talk about, I
hope that you pick it up, you would never say, oh, that's self-published, you know.
No, not at all. Not at all. It is absolutely beautiful. It's a real gift to a person, you know. It's something they would keep and look after.
Yeah, but on the website, mythicalireland.com is the place to get.
Did you mention at one point that it might go on Kindle?
It is actually available for Kindle. Sorry, I should have said that. Yeah.
Okay.
Several of my, not all of them, but several of them are available on Kindle as well. So,
but I certainly would recommend going for the hard copy. And also, just to say that the 2 of the other very important books there, a good 3 of them are available in Waterstones in Drogheda at the moment, and very easily accessible, very easy to order online for any of the other books that are based on Newgrange. Just wonderful, wonderful reading. Anthony, I am so grateful to you for coming on the show. I know you're a busy man and you've got your own shows and there's so much going on at the moment, but this was an absolute treat. Yeah, I'm so delighted you said yes.
Yeah, I've enjoyed myself thoroughly. Good. In fact, you know that you've enjoyed yourself when an hour has passed and it only feels like 10 minutes, you know.
This happens. Unfortunately, that's how I roll.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm really glad you enjoyed the book, and
I did.
that it speaks to you, you know.
Yes. Yes, and this is it. This will draw its own audience, and I so look forward to further publications. And anyone who wants to, you could actually follow him on Facebook as well. But Mythical Ireland is a wonderful resource. If you're watching from abroad and you really want to find out about true Ireland, the true Mythical Ireland, do log on to www.mythicalireland.com and have a look at what Anthony Murphy is doing. Pops up all the time on TV as well. Channel 4, you name it. Just keep your eyes open. Listen, thank you so much for being on the show, everybody. I will see you again soon. Writer's Block is back. So talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.